In a torn up town, no postcode in me, but everybody's like... Hey viewers, my name's Kara. I'm your host for Tuesdays on the Pagan Perspective, and this week we're talking about finding spirituality in unspiritual ways. This week's topic comes from Red Dragon 033195, and they were telling us a story about how they had been studying indigenous faiths and learning similarities in deity across these faiths based on the etymological roots of the names that they give their deities, such as the Proto-Indo-European deity being named, I'm not going to try to pronounce it, but it literally means Sky Father or Heavenly Father, and then through that finding out that that deity inspired or is the same as Zeus, the Dagda, other sorts of Sky Father type gods based on the roots of the words. And then because of that knowledge, this person then looks at those deities in a completely new way, having that sort of knowledge as a backdrop. So their question is, based on that type of story, using that as an example rather, of finding your personal deities through unspiritual ways, whether they be academic, personal, or recreational, how have we found new aspects to our spirituality? They said, we hear a lot about how tarot cards or altars build a practice or build beliefs, but not things that have nothing to do with spirituality on the surface. I had a really hard time thinking of things that I thought had nothing to do with spirituality that I could talk about, because every time I said, oh, okay, this is a way that I developed my spirituality, I immediately then thought, but that's spiritual. But then I remembered that maybe not everyone would consider it spiritual. Like, it's spiritual to me because it's what I do and it's what a lot of people I know do. But it might be considered something that's not spiritual on the surface. So I will talk about those things. So one of the ways that I develop my spirituality, and some of this is developing a relationship with deity and ideas of deity, but it's also just my spirituality in general and how a lot of it works. So I'm not only talking deity here, but I'm also not talking only other things. One of the things is definitely studying and finding out facts from mythology or history, especially when it comes to deities. Finding out little tidbits about them that I didn't know before that resonate with where I am in my life right now or in general. Like finding out that one deity that I've always been curious about is associated with a number that is my favorite number, and that other personality traits about them in certain myths match how I feel about myself at the time or something like that. So definitely studying about things, and of course just reading and studying, you know, the roots of different practices and things like that make me want to try things out or develop new nuances, if you will, to my practice. But then there's also other things like art, which in my notes I said, which may be arguably spiritual since people were depicting deities purposely. So I don't know if you would consider that spiritual or not spiritual, but paintings and art have definitely given me new insight into divine figures specifically and their personalities, such as, if I can find the picture on my computer, I have an image of this painting of Cupid that I had seen in the Cleveland Museum of Art that I talked about in my video from my birthday. I will put a link to that video, and it is a long video, but it's me talking about all these different paintings, many of which had to do with deities, and I learned a lot about my beliefs and other beliefs similar to my practice just at that museum, on that museum trip. But I love this painting of Cupid because the way it depicts him as such like a smirking young kid, and that's not necessarily how you see him all the time, so I really like that. Another thing that really affects my spirituality is theater. There are sort of direct references to how I relate to deity, like Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream has a lot of fantastical, magical type things in it. Carol Churchill's Cloud 9. And very recently, in Cleveland, I saw Venus in Fur last November. Hail Aphrodite. Hail Aphrodite. But then there are also just productions that I've been a part of that were really spiritual for me, like the time that we did an all-female cast of Shakespeare's As You Like It, and that was an opportunity for me to get to know certain male aspects because I was playing 3 men in that, and it was very much about like women coming together and doing this thing that only men used to do, and it was there were a lot of very spiritual things about it. Like, we started the show by standing in a circle silently, and there was no cue, and we just breathed together in and out, and then when everyone felt it was natural, we began the prologue, and that's how the show started. As I recall, my mother's husband was in the audience one day, and during that whispered to her rather loudly, because he's partially deaf, "It's like Children of the Corn." But things like that, and then the production of Hair that I was in. Hair is a very spiritual show for me, so being in shows is also very spiritual for me and adds to my practice or changes things in my practice depending on what I learned from the show. I can't believe I didn't write this in my notes, but also I was in a production of The Last Days of Judas Iscariot by Stephen Adly Guirgis, which you guys hear me mention a lot, especially if you watch my personal channel. That show, so much. I played Mother Teresa, but every aspect of that show, it's about a Bible story, but it had so much to do with my spirituality as well, just because of the message and everything behind it. So theater, up and down, definitely affects my spirituality and helps me learn new things about it. Another thing is books. Mainly when I think of books that have, besides like the nonfiction, how-to, like witchy books that I read, of course those have to do with my spirituality, but the ones that you wouldn't think of as spiritual immediately tend to be, for me, historical fiction or magical realism is what comes to mind. Like Priestess of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley and Diana L. Paxson. That's a huge one. I keep going back to that book. I read it, years and years ago, like back when I was 10 or so, starting my practice. Great, great book. I haven't read the other ones in that sort of series. I've seen the movie Mists of Avalon on YouTube, which I do reference as well, especially the figure of Mother Mary coming out of the priestess image. But Priestess of Avalon is the book that I have that I always go back to. And then there's also The Killian Star by Alison Denny, who is a friend of my mother's. That book directly impacted the way that I receive messages from deity. I read it a couple summers ago, and then there are ways that the characters go about things in the books that then I found, maybe, I don't know if just reading the book opened my mind to that possibility and that worked for me, but that directly affected that. And then things like The Wicked Garden by Lenora Henson, which you may argue is directly spiritual because she is writing it from the stance of it being witchy fiction, magical realism, and her characters are archetypes, but things like that sort of directly influence the way that you see deity and different aspects of spirituality. I'm sure there are others, but those are just the ones that I thought of. And then, of course, I also come across new insights in nature as I think about how the world actually works on a natural level. That's why we often say, or I often say, that magic has more to do with science than people admit, or science has more to do with magic than people admit, because science tells us about the world in which we live and work and worship, and it tells us about the planet that we revere and that we love so much and work with and work to protect, whatever your case may be. Science lets us learn all the little things about that we didn't previously know. So why not have science be a part of your spirituality and use that direct information that we get and that direct understanding that we are allowed to emphasize the other kind of spiritual things that we're doing with that. And the last thing I could think of at the moment is Doctor Who. As I mentioned in my video on the Akashaic Records, Doctor Who kind of makes me think about things in a different way, because I was talking about the Akashic Records and I said, okay, well, if I believe that there's this energy sort of library for the planet Earth, but I believe that there's more than the planet Earth out there, of course there's more than the planet Earth out there, we know that, it's not a belief, it's a fact. Taking that a step further, if I believe that that's true on this planet, then I would also believe that it's true on all planets throughout the universe, and Sierra's jumping up onto the chair now. So while my general belief has always kind of been about the universe as a whole, Doctor Who is one of the sort of pop culture media ways that I think even more about the universe, in a sense. So even things like that affect my spirituality. I'm going to edit this video real quick before I go to work, so I'll see you guys in a couple of weeks, because next week is Subs Week, and we have a really fun thing happening for April. It's going to be a little bit different than we've ever done it. I need to message the collab again to make sure everyone's still on board with it and make sure they got my message from before. It's gonna be a little fun, a little different. I hope you enjoy it. So I'll see you in April. Until then, don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and goodbye.